The kingdom is never divided by force. It breaks apart silently, through misunderstood loyalties, fear disguised as order, and comfort mistaken for peace. This story follows a dominion that believed itself eternal, failing to realize that its greatest threat was not revolt, but the invisible agreement that kept everyone obedient. It all begins before the crown cracks, when silence seems like stability and obedience seems like virtue, until separation becomes inevitable. For years, the kingdom was presented as indivisible, too strong to crumble. But what if the division never needed to be declared? What if it was already happening through silent agreements, small decisions, and concessions accepted without question? The more one observes, the clearer it becomes that the rupture will not come through war or open betrayal, but as a natural consequence of choices made to preserve unity. In the end, the truth will be disturbing. The kingdom was never forcibly divided. It was separated by consent, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to unite. The history of this kingdom begins with a promise of absolute unity. From its foundation, it was taught that strength came from harmony, the absence of visible conflict, and obedience to the center of power. Laws were created to protect stability, and symbols reinforced the idea that everyone belonged to something greater. However, behind this solid appearance, small differences were ignored in the name of peace. Questioning was seen as a threat, not as care. Thus, unity ceased to be a choice and became a silent obligation. It was in this environment, where disagreement seemed dangerous and agreement seemed safe, that the foundations of the kingdom began to crumble without anyone noticing. Over time, the kingdom learned to confuse unity with uniformity. To maintain the appearance of cohesion, differing voices were softened, local traditions diluted, and decisions concentrated in a few points of authority. Everything was done in the name of the common good, but the result was a silent distancing between rulers and the ruled. People still spoke the same language and swore allegiance to the same symbol, but they no longer shared the same interests. The division was not visible because there were no clear lines, only the growing feeling that belonging required giving up essential parts of oneself. The kingdom remained whole on maps and in speeches, but it began to fragment in individual experiences, creating fissures that no one dared to name. As these fissures deepened, the kingdom came to rely more on narratives than on real bonds. Stories of unity were repeated insistently, not to strengthen ties, but to hide the growing distance between the parts. Official celebrations masked everyday tensions, while decisions made at the top rarely reflected common life. Many began to feel that the kingdom existed more as an idea than as a shared experience. Yet few spoke of it, for acknowledging the internal division seemed like a betrayal. Thus, silence became the rule, and loyalty was measured not by participation, but by the absence of questioning. The kingdom remained formally united, but already functioned as several parallel realities connected only by the fear of admitting that something essential had been lost along the way. In this scenario, leadership began to treat any sign of discomfort as a threat to stability. Instead of listening, it reinforced controls, adjusted laws, and amplified speeches about unbreakable unity. The more it spoke of unity, the more evident the distance between promise and reality became. People began to adapt, not out of agreement, but for social survival. Double standards emerged, public loyalty and private skepticism. The kingdom was not divided into opposing sides, but into layers that rarely met. Each group believed it lived the true essence of the whole, while suspecting the others. Thus, fragmentation advanced without direct confrontation, fueled by the constant attempt to deny its own existence. With this silent fragmentation, the kingdom began to function by inertia. The structures remained, the rituals continued, but the original meaning had been emptied. Many followed the rules simply because it had always been that way, not because they believed in them. The idea of unity no longer inspired, it only avoided punishments or exclusions. Gradually, informal alliances emerged, local interests gained priority, and the center lost the capacity to understand the whole. Even so, the appearance of indivisibility was rigorously maintained because admitting separation would mean accepting collective failure. In this way, The kingdom remained whole only on the surface, while inside each part learned to walk alone, preparing the ground for a rupture that would not need to be announced to become real. As the center weakened, a new form of division emerged, more subtle and difficult to combat. There were no borders, only divergent priorities. The kingdom no longer moved as a single body, but as parts that reacted only to what suited them. Decisions were interpreted differently, creating parallel realities that coexisted without true dialogue. Unity remained in official discourse, but in practice, each region, each group, each individual adjusted the kingdom to their own needs. This constant misalignment did not cause immediate collapse, but it eroded collective trust. When no one believes that the whole works for everyone, the idea of belonging weakens. Thus, the kingdom continued to exist, but it no longer operated as a common project, only as a name shared by increasingly distant interests. If this interpretation is making you rethink this story, leave a comment below with your perspective. These videos are meant to provoke reflection, and I read all the comments. And if this type of content interests you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. At this point, the kingdom no longer needed external enemies to fragment. The division came from within, fueled by a lack of mutual trust. Each group began to suspect the intentions of the others, believing that unity always benefited someone different. The feeling of injustice spread silently, transforming cooperation into veiled competition. Even neutral actions were interpreted as hidden threats. The leadership tried to mediate, but spoke to a group that no longer listened in the same way. Thus, the kingdom maintained the appearance of stability, while the emotional foundation that sustained the union crumbled. The true separation was not in territories or laws, but in the inability to recognize the other as part of the same whole. Over time, this distrust transformed into collective weariness. People no longer expected the kingdom to solve their problems, only that it wouldn't hinder them. The idea of the common good lost strength, replaced by the logic of immediate benefit. What held everything together was no longer conviction but habit and fear of the unknown. The kingdom remained united on the outside but emotionally fragmented. Each person carried their own version of the whole, incompatible with that of their neighbor. At this stage, the division was already complete, even without an official declaration. A small shift, an unpopular decision, or an unexpected crisis would be enough to reveal something that had been true for a long time. The kingdom had never been so whole in its symbols and so divided in its intentions. When the crisis finally arises, it doesn't create the division, it merely exposes it. The kingdom reacts as if it were still a single body, but the responses reveal incompatible priorities. Each part expects something different from the center, and the center can no longer respond to everyone. Frustration grows because the promise of indivisibility clashes with real experience. There is no formal rupture, only the collective perception that unity no longer works. At this point, many understand that remaining together requires a greater effort than following separate paths. The kingdom still exists on paper, but it loses its practical function as a shared project. The division consolidates not by declared choice, but by the silent realization that the union no longer delivers what it promised. Following this realization, the kingdom enters a strange state of suspension. Nothing officially changes, but everything functions in an improvised manner. Rules are interpreted according to convenience, authorities lose symbolic legitimacy, and the idea of unity becomes merely a rhetorical argument. People stay together for lack of a clear alternative, not out of genuine belief. The fear of open division becomes greater than the desire for reconstruction. Thus, unity remains a fragile agreement, sustained by collective exhaustion. The kingdom no longer inspires loyalty, only tolerance. And when a system depends solely on tolerance to continue existing, it ceases to be indivisible and begins to survive by postponement, hoping that no one will be the first to admit that the separation has already happened in practice. In this final stage of decay, the kingdom begins to deny the very evidence of fragmentation. Official discourses insist that unity remains intact, while daily life demonstrates the opposite. This denial creates a profound distance between word and experience, causing many to stop taking the common narrative seriously. Unity becomes an empty formality, repeated without conviction. People learn to live with the contradiction, acting as separate parts while pretending to be a whole. The kingdom continues to exist because no one takes responsibility for ending it. There is no collapse, only prolonged stagnation. Indivisibility, once collective pride, becomes a burden, maintained not by strength or faith, but by the inability to imagine something different. This is how the kingdom remains whole in name only, sustained by a continuous refusal to face the truth. Over time, this refusal to face the truth takes its toll. The kingdom loses the ability to react in a coordinated way because there is no longer enough trust for collective decisions. Every action seems late. Every response sounds disconnected from lived reality. Unity, once a source of strength, becomes an obstacle to any real change. Many realize that preserving the appearance of indivisibility requires sacrificing possible solutions. Thus, the kingdom enters a cycle of artificial maintenance, where the effort to keep everything together consumes more energy than building something new. Division is no longer a threat, but a fait accompli, although not recognized. At this point, the kingdom neither falls nor officially divides. It merely remains trapped in a structure that no longer serves, sustained by fear, habit, and the difficulty of admitting that the original promise has not been fulfilled. In the end, the kingdom is never divided by a definitive act because it no longer exists as a real unit. It continues to be cited, remembered, and defended, but only as a concept. People move on, making local decisions, forming new bonds, and redefining belonging without announcing a rupture. Indivisibility dissolves not through betrayal, but through gradual abandonment. What seemed solid reveals itself to have always depended on shared trust, and when that trust is exhausted, nothing replaces it. The kingdom remains as a symbol, not as a practice. And it is in this silent outcome that the truth imposes itself. The kingdom was never forcibly divided. It simply ceased to be lived as a whole. When this happens, there is no war, no spectacular fall, only the belated realization that the separation occurred long before anyone dared to name it. If you enjoyed this approach and want to continue exploring stories that are almost never told this way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And now, click on the video that's appearing on the screen. It directly complements what you just watched and may completely change the way you see this story.